Okay, good evening. So my name is Colin Hughes and I'm head of the Graduate Business School here at TU Dublin. And you're very welcome to this evening's seminar. This is part of our Connected Seminar Series, which we launched last year, really. The idea of the seminar series is to bring together leaders from industry, different aspects of society, to talk to us about really pressing issues. And I can think of no more pressing an issue than sustainability. And we're delighted to invite Ali Sheridan to share her insights with us about business sustainability state of play. So you're all very welcome. Really looking forward to the session, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A afterwards. I would suggest just if you have questions as you go, that you just pop them into the chat function and we'll come back to them at the end for a Q&A. So I'm now going to pass over to my colleague, Dr. Olivia Freeman, just to give Ali a proper introduction. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Colin. Sorry, just getting a couple of last minute people there in the waiting room. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming along this evening to this seminar. I'd like to welcome in particular our students from the Postgraduate Certificate in Sustainability Leadership this evening. I, along with Alico McAlpine and Programme Chair Dr. Lucia Walsh, I'm working with this group of students this semester, and I know that they're very much looking forward to the presentation this evening, Ali. I want to introduce everyone to Ali Sheridan. Ali is a Senior Sustainability and Climate Advisor, and over the course of her career has held positions across the private, public and NGO sectors, including with Bord Bia and IKEA. Ali was part of the inaugural group of Origin Green Ambassadors, where she worked with PepsiCo, Subway and the Sustainable Agricultural Initiative. She has held roles in Bearing Point and Green Schools too. Ali continues to support a range of organisations working to accelerate Ireland's shift to a sustainable economy, while also pursuing a PhD on sustainability leadership with Maynooth Business School. So Ali, you're very welcome to the Connected Seminar Series, and we're absolutely delighted to have you. And I will hand over to you now for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Olivia, and thanks everyone for joining us here this evening. And well done to Olivia and the team with the course. It's fantastic to see more offers coming through for students to follow this field around sustainability, and never have we needed more of them, as we'll go through this evening. So it's a hugely important time for sustainability and climate action. I don't think there's ever been more focus on it, more noise around the issue, and it's getting harder and harder to ignore. But what we're going to try and cover over the next while is really take that industry focus. So, why does business care about sustainability and climate action? Then we're going to kind of look at the response that we're starting to see. So we're hearing a lot about what companies are doing through press releases and net zero strategies. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into the types of responses that are being put forward and maybe where some of the gaps still are. And then have, I suppose, finish off with looking to the future. And where do we need to go to next as industry and also as individual participants within that industry? So I suppose it's very difficult to talk about anything around sustainability, business or not, without first grounding ourselves in what the science is saying. And it's not always easy to take in sometimes the gravity of what it's saying, but it's absolutely vital that we do in any of our work that we're trying to do around corporate and business sustainability, because this is the new world we're living in. And these are the new limits that we have to start respecting in terms of how we move forward. And I think it was really put very effectively together recently by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who was speaking about a report that came off the back of the recent IPCC Code Red for Humanity report, which really set out that we are running out of time on climate action. And he said, we are out of time. This report shows just how far off course we are. The past 5-year period is among the hottest on record. We continue to destroy the things on which we depend for life on Earth. Ice caps and glaciers continue to melt. Sea level rise is accelerating. The ocean is dying and biodiversity is collapsing. This year, fossil fuel emissions have bounced back to pre-pandemic levels. Greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise to new record highs. The results are plain to see, affecting health, lives, and livelihoods everywhere. And look, we could pull up the Road Red for Humanity report and go through the graphs around emissions, but we don't need to anymore. We don't need to look to the reports. We see climate change all around us starting to bite. You know, this summer in particular was story after story about how jurisdictions around the world were getting hit by the impacts of climate change. You know, the severe wildfires in Greece and California, the flooding across Europe, India and the US, you know, shutting down the whole subway system, trapping people in their homes. And these kind of impacts, you know, they're not happening 1 in 100 years anymore. They're threatening our livelihoods, they're threatening our homes, and they're threatening our futures as well. And sometimes we think here in Ireland we're immune to this kind of impacts and these extremes of climate, but it's not so. Again, we don't have to look far to start seeing how those impacts are going to start landing. You know, we're a coastal island where we're very vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal erosion, and we're starting to see that all around our coast at the moment. We know that we're going to get more intense flooding throughout our Midlands and on the west. We know that we have more occurrences of drought, you know, directly affecting one of our biggest industries here, food and ag. You know, I don't remember having hosepipe bans as a kid. Like, I woke up this morning, 6 o'clock, October the 7th, and it was 17 degrees. It's not normal. So we're seeing all these signs of climate now changing right in front of us. This isn't an issue for 10, 20 years. This is happening today. And I suppose it's not just about emissions, although we tend to box climate action and you know, try to climb it into that. This is going to affect every part of our lifestyle and interacts with so many other issues. If we think about our biodiversity, our natural world, everything we have built as a society, all our plans and our hopes for the future are built on the assumption that our natural world stays healthy, that our climate remains stable, and we just don't have that assurance anymore. We know that our biodiversity is under pressure, that we're pumping plastics into our sea. We know that invasive species are moving in because it's starting to get warmer, that our health and our quality of our lives are being impacted by degrading air quality. We're losing 1,300 people a year prematurely because of our air quality in Ireland, because of how we power our homes, how we move about. We know that migration is going to become an increasingly important issue, both inward migration in terms of people moving over to Ireland, trying to escape climate extremities, and also within Ireland as well. How are we going to support those in coastal communities in those areas where extremities are going to hit, to move to safer grounds, to find you know, future homes to inhabit? And look, you know, when we look at what's causing all this, we can look to emissions. I mean, we know things like energy and fossil fuels are a big part of the problem here, how we power things, you know, the kind of coal, oil and gas sources. But we also know that they completely interact with lots of other industries. But the other big issue that we don't talk enough about is consumption as well. You know, as a global society, our consumption continues to increase. We're consuming over 100 billion tons of stuff every year, with very little of that making it back in terms of circular economy into reuse. You know, and this is all putting continued pressure on our planet that is trying to tell us it's under stress and that we need to do more to protect it. So this is the big figure we hear about all the time, 1.5 degrees. And the 1.5 degrees is the ceiling of global average temperature increase that we cannot exceed. This is the limit that scientists tell us. If we push our Earth beyond that, we get into very dangerous territory. And again, coming back to that point that everything we have built has been on the presumption that our climate remains stable. When we push beyond 1.5, we really start to lose that assurance, and we're already beyond 1.1 degrees. And we have a very limited window of time now to take ambitious action to keep this in check. And the challenge is huge. And I think it's important to understand the scale of what's being asked, especially when we're planning the way we're going to spend our future years and where we're going to spend our efforts, because this is asking something of society that it's never done before. So this is our kind of emissions profile over the decades. And as you can see, from 1950, we saw quite a rapid jump from the Industrial Revolution when we started to get into powering things and consumption. And now if we're going to stay under that 1.5 degree ceiling, we have to take that green line. And that is a sharp, rapid, consistent reduction in emissions every single year, about 7% reduction every year. And if you think for COVID and everything that we sacrificed and all the limitations that were put on us, we only achieved about a 5% reduction in emissions, you know, and a reduction that we've already lost as we've reopened society and we start to emit again. 7% is a huge ask. So I suppose this isn't to scare you, or this isn't to put us into a mindset of doomism. This is actually to let us understand the scale of the challenge so that we can think differently about how we move forward, that we can be braver in terms of what we're asking industries and wider society to do, and that we can feel more comfortable challenging business as usual, because business as usual is not going to help us close this gap. So what's driving business sustainability? Because I think it's fair to say business hasn't always interacted with the science. We haven't always heeded what it's been saying. But the science is now translating to a bunch of other pressures that are really putting a spotlight on industry and the role it's playing in climate change and the role it should be playing in terms of climate action and sustainability. So we know that we're getting pressures from lots of different places, and no more so direct than the supply chain. So industry is really starting to understand its vulnerability, particularly in global economies like Ireland, where we're very, I suppose, dependent on stock consistently coming in and yields being, the same amount, same price every year. But that's not the case now with rising climate change and with those extremities we're seeing around the world. If you think back to Storm Ophelia, and we all panicked when there was no bread or milk on the shelves, just how quick and short those shocks can actually have an impact directly on our day-to-day life. If we take something like coffee is, our consumption of coffee is growing, particularly here in Ireland. But coffee grows at a very unique part of the world with very unique conditions that support its growth. And we know that through climate change, that region of the world is coming under pressure. So this year, up to a third of the harvest was lost because of a severe frost. And the price of coffee has, of course, gone up. So direct impacts happening, day after day in terms of how that weather, how those extremities are putting pressure on those materials that we presume we will have in 10 years' time, that we presume we will be able to get into the country at a certain price to keep our business model going. But that's not the case anymore. We also know that consumers are tuning into sustainability and climate issues more than they ever have. And while I suppose we see report after report that consumers will pay more for sustainable products, I'm not always convinced if that's the case. But what we do know is that they are looking for brands to help them live more sustainable lives, or to help them take the more sustainable option. We see anecdotal evidence all around us in terms of search terms on Google, particularly during lockdown. We saw a huge increase in people looking into how to live more sustainably when they had a bit of time and space to do it. On Pinterest, the sustainable living is top trending as well. So while it's not always going to be about getting a higher price for products, it's going to be around consumer brand and consumer loyalty, consumer retention, and like I say, helping consumers live out their values through offering them the alternatives that they don't have today. We know that employees are starting to make their voices be really heard, a really important driver of sustainability. We saw marches of the likes of employees from Amazon demanding that their company does more around climate action. We see groups organizing within and across organizational boundaries to come together to understand how can they make a positive impact within their industry, how can they push their employers to do more about this space. They want to be part of the solution, not part of industries that are part of the problem. And we see groups self-organizing all around the world and here in Ireland as well. So we have groups like Irish Doctors for the Environment. These are health professionals who know that climate change is going to make their job harder. It is going to put more stress on an already strained health system. So they've come together to raise the voice of the health industry and ask for our government and others to do more around climate action. We have Irish Architects Declare, a group of architects who know that their industry is a big contributor to climate change. Everything from the steel and the concrete and the materials has an impact in terms of emissions, and they want to work together to see how they can green those processes and share those learnings and scale their impact. Purpose Disruptors, a brilliant coming together of the creatives and the marketing professionals in Ireland who know, again, that they've had a role to play in terms of consumption and influencing what we buy and the kind of lifestyles that we live, and now really committed to switching that and supporting consumers and supporting wider society and living more sustainably and using those creative skills, those storytelling abilities that we hugely need, that scientists and maybe academics haven't been so good at, but we need to hear those stories of what a better future will look like and to engage the wider society with it. And litigation. It is getting harder to hide from climate inaction. So we're seeing now a big shift in the courts in terms of their focus on who's not playing their part and pushing them to do so. So we now have nearly 2,000 examples of climate litigation that's gone through the courts around the world. These are cases that are taken on governments, taken on corporations, and even increasingly against individuals again. see some examples, like in the Netherlands, one of the first cases to be successful, where the people took their government to court around their climate inaction, demanded that they increase their climate targets, and the government was forced to do it, and forced to do it quite quickly. So big sweeping changes coming into that country within a matter of a few months. Here in Ireland, we had a similar case, Climate Case Ireland, again, where we had Friends of the Irish Environment lead a case against our government around a climate mitigation plan, that it was not in any way reflective of the scale of the challenge. And now the government having to respond now with more ambition, heightened targets, and more commitment to getting climate action done. And against companies, just a few weeks ago, we saw Shell lose their case in terms of they not doing enough again around climate action. You know, they had the strategy, they had the report, but it's not enough in terms of their impact on climate, but not just today, their legacy impact. We didn't just start emitting yesterday. So companies need to be responsible for their role in climate change since their day of inception, not just, you know, from last week or last month. And also around the language around sustainability. So it's a really murky area, let's say, in terms of the terminology that we use and how it should be used. So everything from environmentally friendly, conscious, natural, it's largely unregulated. But again, that's starting to be cracked down on. So we have cases like H&M in Norway being, you know, brought under the spotlight for their conscious collection, which, you know, is a great effort in terms of using sustainable materials, but is a tiny part of their overall business. And the company, I suppose, being accused of using that one good part to halo what they were doing and not actually tackle their root issues. Ryanair taken to task in the UK, and again, talking about having the most environmentally friendly fleet, which might be great, but if you're consistently increasing your flights, then your overall carbon impact is going up. And the UK in the last few weeks just launched a green claims code, hugely detailed in terms of terminology and what that terminology can cover. Everything from net zero, environmentally friendly, life cycle analysis, all covered now. So companies really going to have to be careful about the language they're using, and most importantly, back it up with proof points. And investors, the money, the finance, where it's flowing from, really shining a light now on sustainability and climate. So the language they use is ESG, environmental and social governance, and they're interested in risk. They're interested in knowing if the industries that they're investing in have thought about how climate is going to impact their business models. Are they going to be around in 10 or 20 years? Are they going to be able to get carbon out of their supply chains? And really looking again for those proof points about how the companies and how industries are going to shift with the climate transition. And we're seeing kind of finance being linked to lots of sustainability strings in lots of ways. So for example, companies like Tesco taking out sustainability loans where the finance is directly linked to positive sustainability outcomes. We see things like green bonds coming to the fore as well, but we still do have some issues around ESG. There's still not enough clarity in terms of what actually is a sustainability investment. And for example, we had an occurrence there where a tobacco company scored quite highly on ESG. They were growing the tobacco quite sustainably, supporting the smallholders, but that completely ignores, I suppose, the S in ESG and the impact of a tobacco company on things like our public health. And disclosure and reporting, everyone's favorite job, I'm sure. And if you're not into acronyms, sustainability might be the wrong space for you. But as you can get a sense from that slide, it is just a busy landscape of more and more pressure being put on companies to report more about their impacts on sustainability, to disclose their wider impacts as a whole company about what they're doing. But we're starting to see some big shifts. So some of the problems that we have and challenges at the moment is there's too many benchmarks and frameworks, but we're starting to see them be standardized. And we're seeing quite a big shift from what was a voluntary activity, companies being urged to do it, but now being mandated to do it, particularly from an EU level now, where a lot more companies around Europe, including in Ireland, are going to have to provide a lot more detail about what they're claiming they're doing on sustainability, how they're preparing for the transition, and again, taking that wider outlook in terms of their whole impact as a company. So it's a big shift change from where we were. And regulation and policy, so much happening in this space that's really starting to, like say, just, you know, not leave companies much room to hide in terms of what they have to do here. So we obviously had 2015, a big landmark year in terms of the Paris Agreement, in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals that at the time hugely celebrated, you know, and really did, I suppose, change the landscape in terms of where we were focusing and the language that we were using, and the SDGs in particular helping us break out of that just an emissions only view and think about the holistic impact, creating a better society, bringing everyone with us, but didn't deliver the impact that we needed. So we know that if everything that was agreed in Paris was done, we wouldn't be on a track to stay within 1.5 degrees. We'd be more about the 3 degrees, which again is very dangerous territory. So it was a starting point, but we need to move things on now, move them quite rapidly. So at EU level, we have the Green Deal, the EU trying to rewrite everything they do now with a green climate lens, how they finance activities, the mandatory reporting companies are going to do, cleaning up all that terminology around sustainable finance, and trying to really use their leverage to raise the collective ambition of industries and business throughout the EU. And here in Ireland, we have a very live, I suppose, rollout of a lot of change in the next few weeks and months in terms of our climate policy. So we just had the Climate Action Bill signed through before the government broke for the summer. And now in the next few weeks, we're going to have our updated climate action plan. We're going to have sectoral roadmaps as well for different industries. So this is going to take the kind of Irish pie of emissions and decide which industry is going to do what. And again, if you remember that Ireland is on a track to achieve a 51% reduction by 2030, that is a huge ask. So no matter where you are in the industry or where you are in the sector, it's going to ask a lot of you in terms of changing how you do things, getting carbon out of your operations and your supply chains, and really rethinking probably your whole business model and how we can make it fit with that trajectory of 51% reduction. And then it's all eyes to Glasgow. So Glasgow is the big follow-up event now to Paris. It should have happened last year, but with COVID, it was pushed. And this is where really we'll get a sense of the global ambition for how big we're going to go on climate action. And with reports like the IPCC and Code Red for Humanity, it's a lot at stake at these conversations. The positives are we have more countries than ever around the table agreeing to come forward and be part of the discussions. We have big emitters like China and India. The US is back. They had left under Trump, they're back under Biden. We're starting to hear some exciting, some ambitious level of commitment around how quickly decarbonisation will happen, how collaboration will happen across different sectors, how we here in the rich, developed global north would support the global south in their transition. We're going to try and have to support them to skip all the fossil fuel dependencies that we've built up and get straight onto cleaner energy and supporting them in acquiring the quality of life that we have while not paying for fossil fuels. So there's a lot going on. There's more pressure than ever in terms of the focus for industries and business to do something about it. So we've really started to see a shift in how industry is responding. But I suppose before we look forward, we have to just look back and see where industry has come from. And really the beginnings of corporate sustainability was, in CSR, corporate social responsibility. So this was very much industry trying to find its place in society, be a good neighbor, give back. And it was all good stuff, supporting charities and causes, supporting employee engagement initiatives, maybe doing a bit of resource efficiency as well in terms of energy and water and waste. But very quickly realized it's not going to be enough in terms of the response to the climate crisis that we need. So then we saw a shift to the triple bottom line concept. I'm sure you've seen this 1,000 times at this stage, but trying to get business to go for that spot in the middle, where it can be a sweet spot between serving the needs of society, staying within those limits that we know we have to in terms of planetary boundaries, and also keeping the business in profit as well. In theory, this sounds great. It sounds exactly like what we should be doing. But what happened is that this theory was abused essentially, and we didn't get that sweet spot in the middle. We got a lot of talk about what we were going to do for the environment and for society, but it was largely business as usual. But now we're into the next phase of corporate sustainability. And this is the phase that understands that we have planetary limits and we have to respect them as industries and figure out how we exist within that 1.5 degree world. So that puts business in a different perspective. It doesn't give us so much of a choice of, doing environmental stuff when we can, when Brexit is finished, when we're over the COVID crisis. Climate isn't waiting. Climate doesn't care about what is distracting. And there is a cost to inaction on this as well. It's not like we can ignore it and think that others are going to pick up the slack. Every industry is at risk if they don't transition and get prepared for climate change. So it's a whole new way of thinking about business. It's not tinkering at the edges, it's bringing sustainability to the core of what you're about and ensuring that your business model can exist within those planetary limits. So at the moment, we're seeing day after day net zero strategies. The sustainability strategy has been largely replaced with net zero strategies. And this is companies mapping out their trajectory to a 1.5 degree existence. So, we're seeing great ambition, great targets, longer term thinking. And I suppose it's been what we've been waiting for, right, for a long time, to see this level of acceptance of climate change from industry and this level of commitment to what comes next. And what we're also seeing is the widening of the scope of industry as well. So when we talk about emissions and impact, we talk about them in 3 different scopes. Our first scope is, if you imagine a retailer, for example, it's what's happening in the 4 walls. So your energy use, your water use, your waste. Your scope 2 is your energy, where you're sourcing your energy. Is it fossil fuels or is it renewable? And your scope 3 is everything else. So largely what's happened is we've had plans that look at scope 1 and 2, which is great. But again, it is nowhere near an ambitious enough response for the climate crisis we're in now. So scope 3 takes everything else into account. So for example, how are your suppliers creating their products? How are they moving them from A to B, and what kind of fleet? Looking then on the other downstream activities to the end consumer as well. So what happens to the product after it leaves the store? How does the consumer use it in their home? How do they dispose of it? And when you start to see everything that's at play, you start to understand how wide an impact one business can have and why it's so important that they take this wider approach. And just to give you an example of how big that is, for some industries, more than 90% of their impact comes from scope 3, particularly around food and particularly around fashion. So if, for example, you think of something like shampoo, the biggest impact comes from how long you're in the shower for, how your shower is heated. Is it a power shower? If you buy ice cream, the big impact comes for how long you keep it in the freezer, how you're powering that freezer. So again, there's a different way completely now for business and industry to understand those wider impacts, understand how they can support us as consumers and people in our homes to make more sustainable choices. We see the shift to science-based targets as well. So gone are the days are 10% energy reduction or 20% water reduction use, targets you're going to achieve. They have to be science-based. They have to take what the scientists are telling is that pathway to 1.5, and we have to convert them to be industry and business specific and map them out. So is your business, is your industry doing its fair share of carbon emission reductions based on what the science is telling us? And this is a big step up for industry, and it takes a lot of effort to get these targets in place. But this is the level of insight that we need and the level of attention that we need to give the topic. So in terms of strategies, we're starting to see much bigger ambition. This is Microsoft from just over a year ago, I think now at this stage, talking about being not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative by 2030. So taking, in more emissions than they're putting out, addressing their historical emissions as well. So again, like I say, companies didn't just start emitting yesterday. Companies have been emitting for decades, depending on how long they've been existing. So how are they going to take responsibility for their whole entire impact? I'm starting to see big finance now come into innovation, 1 billion in Microsoft's case. M&S just launched their new strategy. So they're going for net zero across scope 3, so that's wider supply chain by 2040. Their supply chain is 97% of their impact. So, it's kind of mad that we never looked at scope 3 before, but that's where the impact is and where the focus has to be. They're looking at consumer behavior, so using their loyalty program Sparks to reward customers that bring back clothes for their, their swapping with Oxfam. They're looking at making partnerships, in this case, Reboot the Future, helps young people and business leaders support themselves in terms of living lower carbon lives. So trying to widen their impact beyond just their products and doing lots of employee initiatives as well. Mars are going for net zero by 2050, looking at their supply chain. And again, these are huge numbers, 20,000 suppliers now needing support about how they're going to create products more sustainably, grow them, get out emissions, get out carbon, get out packaging. But again, this is where the impact is happening and where we need to support coming true. And this is the co-op, one of my favorite, I have to say, strategies in terms of its holistic approach. So their key kind of principles are they're going to follow the science in terms of what it's saying. They're going to aim for a fair and just transition and going to cooperate as well, because no one company can do this alone. So, some of the headline targets that they're doing is around long-term changes. This won't happen fast. It has to be a long-term vision and commitment to this. But equally, we need those shorter term milestones along the way. We cannot be saying 100% by 2050 and doing nothing up until 2040. We have to front load a lot of that effort. Looking at the product carbon emissions, making it easier for customers to make choices, helping suppliers, campaigning for climate action, speaking up, lobbying for progressive climate action. This is the new ground for business as well. It can't all be happening behind the scenes. They need to call for more national and international leadership on this as well. So we're seeing sustainability officers become, very important leadership members within companies. We're seeing remuneration being linked to climate outcomes, because we did have for too long a situation where, you're rewarded for business growth, business as usual growth, increased sales, increased market share, new products, doesn't reflect what the climate is saying. So now you need to build in those climate outcomes and reward our people for that. We're seeing the CSO become the CEO, people with the mindset that connect the dots on business and a new climate world and how they can interact together. And the circular economy, so many examples around new businesses figuring out how to close the loop. We've got Loop, for example, where you get, to your door, your products in reusable containers, refillable, so you're not getting the packaging every week and throwing it out. We have IKEA moving to rental and leasing models. Depop, which I'm sure loads of you are familiar with, is again, platforms that are growing 28 to 30 times faster than your high street fashion. There is a market there in terms of pre-loved and reused things as well. And our whole relationship with ownership is changing. So there's massive opportunities. Also seeing the likes of innovation. So this is Winnow food waste bin. We waste a third of our food around the world. It's not just the food being wasted, it's the water that went into the food, the energy that was needed to make it, the fertilizers, the human effort that it took to make that happen, and we throw away a third of it. So what Winnow is trying to do is it's a smart bin where you're scraping your plate off and it's telling you what's going into the bin. If it's cucumber constantly, then the chef can go back and take it off the menu. The clients clearly aren't liking it. It helps inform future practices, future menus. Have toast as well, toast beer made from the waste bread as well. So again, closing that loop in terms of what is waste and reusing what's already out there. We have eco labels coming back fast. These were actually trialed about 15 years ago and nobody engaged with them. We weren't ready. We didn't understand what is 260 grams. Is that good or bad? But very much companies feeling now that the customer is ready. They are hungry for this information, and we're starting to see, carbon become the new calorie essentially on pack, with products telling you, how much in the product, whether that's good or bad, and helping you make better decisions. And locally owned co-ops and community-based enterprises and businesses popping up as well. For Ireland, we've not been great at this. Over the last few decades, we've moved away from our kind of roots in co-ops, but we're starting to get back there. If you look at the energy transition in particular, we have to learn big lessons from our last attempt at a renewable energy, where our communities didn't benefit from the big shift. We have massive opportunities here in terms of renewables, but we've better ways of doing it, like the examples of community power, where the local community benefits directly from this development in renewable energy, where that money that goes into the community is felt locally around, and the benefits are spread more widely as well. And B Corps, so new models of business altogether. We've got B Corps who are changing their legal structure so that they don't exist purely just to get profit. They exist to meet the needs of wider stakeholders, including the environment. And in Ireland, we were off to a bit of a slow start with B Corps, but we're absolutely flying it now in terms of the number of companies that are signing up and going through what is quite a tedious, invasive process, finding out how your industry works, what are your policies and practices, where you're sourcing, how you're treating your suppliers, your workers, what you're doing for your local community, and then your environmental impacts as well. But really putting sustainability and climate completely central to the business. And change is just happening so rapidly. If we look at something like your traditional car that was built on fossil fuels, gas and oil, the shift to EVs is happening so much more faster than anyone anticipated. So this is Honda, for example. Their original target to stop producing old cars and move to own EVs was 2030, then it was 2028, and now it's 2022. And we see that across a lot of car companies. The EV infrastructure, charging infrastructure is going much quicker. Governments are signing in, phasing out periods for old cars much quicker than anticipated. The technology is getting cheaper and more commercial. So we're seeing this ratchet effect as we think braver and more ambitious. The technology comes into play, it scales, the price comes down, and things are happening, like I say, much faster than we thought. Similarly here with solar, like the price of solar just absolutely dropping, making it so much more scalable and commercial in terms of production as well. But I guess you sense that there is a but coming here. So there is great stuff happening and the pace is absolutely picking up. But there's a few things that we definitely need to keep an eye on in terms of how we move forward. Again, when we think about business sustainability, we have to come back to this idea of planetary limits and climate action. We can't just do what we're able to do today, what we have the resources to do today. We have to understand how our business, how our industry, how our sector fits within that 1.5 degree world. And the reality here and around the world is that our emissions are continuing to increase. At a time we know they have to come right down, they're continuing to increase. So we need a complete shift in our mindset to sustainability, and one that respects planetary limits. And if we look a bit deeper into all the net zero strategies that we're seeing, there's some gaps and there's some red flags. So this is a research done by Climate Action 100, and they looked at the biggest companies and what they were saying in their net zero strategies. And they found that none of them, not one of the companies, had given their full detail about how they're actually going to get to net zero. Half of them didn't talk about the full scope. So if you remember that scope 3, they just focused on the easier stuff. No company had allocated enough finance to do this. And only a third had linked climate outcomes to executive pay. So they're real worrying signs in terms of we're hearing a good game around sustainability and climate action, but we're not yet confident about the detail about how this is going to get done. And we've also got a rush on offsets at the moment. So offsetting your emissions and your climate output is when you buy credits for things like tree planting or biodiversity restoration to offset your emissions. And what we have now is a lot of strategies putting a lot of focus on offsets and technologies like carbon capture storage, which, if they work, will be great, but we don't know enough about either yet. We don't know enough about how effective offsets are. We haven't studied them long enough to know if they actually take in enough CO2 that we hope that they do. We also have ethical questions about, where is the land that we're buying up? Are we buying up developed countries' land just so we can continue to live with the lifestyle that we have today? And what are the ethical considerations that we need to think of there? And similarly, with technology like carbon capture storage, we cannot create strategies based on technology that doesn't yet work to the standards we think it does. We need to do the work today and get emissions down. We know that companies as well are talking out of both sides of their mouth on climate. So we're seeing the big net zero strategy, we're hearing all the great press release about it, but then we're also hearing about companies lobbying behind the scenes to stop progressive climate measures. And lobbying and how companies talk and stand up for climate is going to be the new litmus test for how serious they are. We cannot continue to have this double speak around climate. If you're getting in the way of progressive regulation, then you're part of the problem as an industry, and you have to pick a side in terms of if you're going to help that wider shift or you're going to continue to delay it. And talking of delay, this is probably our biggest red flag in terms of corporate climate action and climate action at large. So we've kind of moved away from, climate denial. There's larger consensus now that this is happening, and I suppose more than 98% of scientists telling us that the climate is changing. But now we're into this era of climate denial. And it looks different, no matter who you're talking to. It might be whataboutism. What about China? Sure, aren't they bigger than Ireland? What about fashion industry? What about the agricultural industry? What about, the other big emitter? Why do I have to do anything when they're doing that? Again, that's a delaying factor. We are all going into the same storm here, and we all need to take climate action as much as we can, that's reflective of our impact and our legacy impact as well. We have doomism as well. The problem is too big, we can't do anything about it, let's just keep going as we're going. That's absolutely not true. We have the biggest opportunity over the next few years that we've ever had to get this under control. Every degree we stop the world increasing will have a positive impact, and we can't lose sight of that. And individualism as well. We have spent too long putting this on individuals to do. Use your keep cup, use your tote bag. And look, of course, you should do everything within your means to take climate action, but it can't just be about the individual. We need organizations and corporations and our governments to make those sustainable choices the most obvious choice, the most accessible choice, the easiest choice for us, so that we unlock many more individuals to actually go and take the action. And it's not something that people can only do when they can afford it, or when they have time, or when they have the knowledge. It is the status quo of how we live. So with all that happening in terms of the scale of the challenge, the response we've seen so far, and some of the gaps that we need to close, what comes next for corporate sustainability? So just to ground us again, this is the roadmap we're on, okay? The sharp, sustained, rapid 7% emission reduction year on year. And for Ireland, if you imagine our industries, this is what we have to achieve. So on the left there is kind of business as usual, the different sectors, what they're emitting at the moment. By 2030, we have to squeeze that into that yellow box. So think about everything that has to change to make that happen. Where are you going to get carbon out of your business model? Where are you going to think around in your supply chain and how you're going to look at alternatives? Maybe you're going to switch from a linear model to a circular model. Where are you going to collaborate potentially with your competitors to achieve some of this? It is a huge ask. And then when you look to 2050, it is just a dot in emissions. So we have to think much bigger. We have to think much braver around corporate climate action as well. And the thing to remember with climate action is that it's inevitable. Okay, it's not if, it's just how and when. And the earlier we act and the more prepared we act, the more fair this transition will be, and the more just it will be, and the more smoother it will be. But to think that any industry that can continue as it is today is to not take in what the science is trying to tell us. We can't just continue to buy things as we're buying, living as we're living. The seas will rise around us, the wildfires will come to our door, and climate action is inevitable. And we're going to hear, particularly as we run up to COP now in the next few weeks, COP26, lots more announcements around strategies and pledges and collaborations and targets, and it's all good stuff. But we need to be looking at these, with a bit of a keener eye. We are gone past the stage of any progress is enough. It has to be progress that is reflective of climate science and that scale of the challenge that we have to tackle. So kind of questions I would be looking at in terms of looking at these strategies and industry's efforts would be, has the company or the industry completed a climate risk assessment? Do they understand what the science is telling will happen to their industry? For example, if their factories and plants are near coastal areas, are they likely to be impacted by sea level rise or flooding? If they're growing products or raw materials that they depend on to make their products, are they being grown in areas that are going to be impacted by more drought? What's the plan then for 10 or 20 years to make sure that you're not impacted, that you're thinking about alternatives, that you're supporting the people in those areas that are dependent on you buying that product? Are the targets absolute or intensity based? So we're going to see a lot of talk about efficiencies gained throughout strategies. But you can make, your one product, whether it's your phone, a bottle of water, food, you can make that as efficient as possible. But if your absolute emissions as an industry are growing, then the climate maths doesn't add up. This has to be about absolute reductions. Is the company talking about their scope 3 target, their wider supply chain target? What are they going to do to help their suppliers? What are they going to do to help us in the home use the product more sustainably? Are the targets science-based? If they're talking about an ambitious climate target and it's 10% of energy, is that in line with what the science is saying? What percentage of the effort will happen before 2030? So like I say, this can't be a target for 2050 that we won't deal with, for another 10 years that we'll hand over to the next generation. We have to front load the effort between now and 2030. We're catching up on decades of inaction, and we have to lean in and do this work in the next few years. Look at offsets and how they're being used. Are they being used to just balance out business as usual, or are they being used as a limited tool while the company gets on that wider journey of absolute reduction? How fair is the strategy? How is the company talking about its suppliers, its employees, the communities that depend on it in terms of how it's transitioning and likely to change? How is it going to bring those stakeholders with them? And is the company even talking about biodiversity and natural capital? We're in a climate, but also a biodiversity crisis as well. So how is the company addressing biodiversity and natural capital through its strategy? And for us, I suppose, for people who are going to work in these industries, who are hopefully going to drive change as well, we're in a really unique position now. Yes, it is challenging, and yes, it is difficult, but also we have the license to think differently, to think more bravely, to be more courageous about what we ask and what we lead our industries into over the next 10 years or so. So we need to challenge business as usual. It does not add up in a climate world, and it will not be allowed to continue. The planet will not allow it. So we need to be braver in challenging business as usual. We need to reflect on our own work as well. You know, is the work that we're doing, is it asking enough of industries, or is it buying them more time to do business as usual? Is it giving the illusion that stuff is happening, but actually it's not? The numbers are continuing to increase. We need to speak up more, and whether that's as individuals or as the companies we're working for, we've got to speak up more for climate and stick our neck out a little bit here. You know, this is going to take, like I say, bravery. This is going to take more voices demanding climate action if we're going to see the shift that we need. It cannot be one organization, can't even be one sector. It's going to have to be a collective effort. We're going to have to work together and collaborate. We're going to have to break down those awkward barriers. You know, we all say we collaborate as industries, but we don't really share how things are getting done. We don't share what's happening in the supply chain. We need to open them right up. And again, this is in response to a climate crisis. So we have to throw out our old ways of doing things and holding each other to account as well. We're only going to be as strongest as our weakest link on this. So what industries are delaying progress? What companies are not playing ball or doing their fair share and moving forward? And we need to be able to ask more of each other. So again, that it's a fair transition and that we get where we need to get as fast as we can. And look, I'll finish with this. You know, the world we live in is forever going to be changed by climate. You know, if you're under 40 like me, our future is going to look very different than it did for our parents and for our grandparents. You know, we don't have the assurances of that stable climate that they grew up with. And sustainability and climate action is going to become a part of all our worlds. You know, whatever industry you're in, whatever sector you're in, whatever position you're in. And, you know, it's important to say that, you know, no one is going to save us here. There's no one politician that's going to fix everything. There's no one technology that's suddenly going to, you know, suck all the carbon out of the world. This is up to all of us. And while I know that, you know, it can be scary and overwhelming sometimes, it's a position of privilege to have the certainty of what the science is telling us and to have the knowledge and expertise and ability to do something about it. You know, so we need to decide, I suppose, if we're going to spend another decade tinkering around the edges, or if we're actually going to lean in and deal with the complexity of climate action and demand more of the industries we're working for, the organizations we're working for, and working together on that. You know, and I do hope we lean in, because I think, you know, we can create something brilliant moving forward. We have license now to think completely differently, to learn from the lessons of the past and create something, you know, amazing in terms of how our response to climate action and how brave that is. And I'm not sure what could be more important than fighting for our future. And that is what we're fighting for at the moment. So I hope you're still with me. It's hard to see here on Zoom, but Olivia, happy, of course, to take any questions. And if you want to get in touch with me after today, that's my email there, or Twitter if you're so inclined.
Thank you so much, Ali. That was absolutely fantastic. Such an insightful presentation. I think the scientific facts they're very complex and they're stark, but it was encouraging to see the number of organizations that you were able to highlight that who are engaging in strategic change towards more sustainable business practices. I think what you have to say is very energizing, and I think a lot of people here will agree with that, and hugely thought-provoking. And we've got lots of questions in the chat, as you probably saw them pinging in. Good. So I think what I'm going to do is I might just unmute all, and I'll ask people who don't want to speak to mute themselves again, and then anybody who wants to maybe speak to their question can. Okay, so I'll go back up. There was a few questions from the beginning. Here's the first one. The first name I can see there is Kira, who had a question around carbon offsetting. Kira, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I know you touched on the carbon offsetting side of things, and I suppose my question was more, is it sustainable? And you did touch on, you know, a lot of companies are just using it to kind of, you know, make amends for the damage that they're doing, but they're not actually doing any benefit. Like, is there a way of stopping that, or do you think the carbon offsetting is actually something that is beneficial for the future within its limitations?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to think about when we're talking about climate offsets is the context in which it's used. So, like, you know, we are in a little bit of a state of panic in terms of a corporate response. This has crept up on a lot of industries, or they haven't, you know, decided not to look at it for so long, but they can't ignore it. So they're having to come out with these net zero strategies. But that kind of change takes years, takes time to turn those ships around. So in the interim, they're going big on offsets, and that's including here in Ireland. But what that means is we haven't had time to create, you know, strong enough standards about what is a good offset, or indeed prove if it actually is doing what we hope it's doing. So for example, a lot of these offsets are based on tree planting, and, you know, trees suck in emissions, that's great, but we're basing their ability to do that on maybe 2 years of studying them. And this is a forest that might be, you know, for 100 years. So we don't know if that tree continues to suck in year on year what it did within those 2 years. And we have some big questions about that. So I think there will be a role for offsets, you know, for that balancing when we get to net zero, you know, where we can recreate our sinks, whether that's trees, whether that's our bogs, our seas, and then getting emissions right down. But for me, the big test that if a company is using offsets, what are they doing about absolute emission reductions, and where are they showing us the detail and proof of that? And that is the most important, because the most dangerous thing about offsets is when they're used as a context to change nothing and to just offset business as usual. And that is just not preparing the business for what's coming, you know, and getting them into the mindset of transformation, which is what this is about.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Ciara. And Cillian actually has a question around, you know, kind of, I think maybe a little bit what you're alluding to there around kind of publicly available information around activities. Would you like to come in, Cillian?
Yep. Cheers for the talk, Ali. So, number one, is it realistic for us to hope for, in, we'll say, Ireland's climate action plan, that we have a 51% reduction if we're already not meeting that? And then from there, when they are targeting specific companies or specific industries, is there a penalty for missing that? Is it legally binding? And is the reporting of their progress available publicly?
Great questions. Don't have the answer to them all. I'm asking the same.
Sorry.
But no, it's on the first question, it has to be, Cillian, 51% has to be. That's not even enough in terms of what the science is telling us, but it's the most realistic, you know, with a bit of ambition that we can be. And that's coming from a point, you know, Ireland is only second to Denmark in terms of what we're trying to do in terms of emission cuts in that tiny window of time that we have. But we have, you know, but that's coming from decades of inaction as well, if that makes sense. So yes, the sectoral roadmaps will, you know, we've yet to see who's going to be doing what, and that will be very much live over the next few weeks. I'm sure industries fighting their case for not having to do so much, maybe. Maybe they'll lean in, maybe you'll be surprised. Penalties, we don't know yet how that's going to look like. But I do imagine things like supports, etc., will be linked in green strings, and we'll start to see those nudges and influences. And from a what they're doing point of view, so the Climate Action Plan has to provide an annual progress review, which is positive. And for a lot of our companies now, they're going to fall under a new European mandatory reporting regime, which they haven't before. So that's going to give us a lot more insight into a bigger cohort of companies in Ireland. You know, at the moment, we literally only have a handful whose information is decent information, is publicly available. That's going to widen right open now. So I'm not fully sure what will happen in the next few weeks, but we do have these signs of change. But I doubt it'll be enough. I think we're going to need more nudges as the year go on to make things happen.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Cillian. And Gosia has quite a few questions in the chat there. Gosia, do you want to come in and maybe focus in on one or two?
It's a big one. It's one big question. You know, our policy, if you're talking about policies, our Irish policies and European policies are now based on the Green Deal. And it's great. And before Green Deal, we had Paris Agreement. And as we know, there was lots of pledges and it was pointless. Because actually, even if all the countries together did what they wanted to do, it wouldn't meet what we need to meet. So I wonder, Green Deal seems for me, at the beginning when I saw it, I was very excited. And then I was digging deeper and deeper. And now I'm worrying a little bit, is Green Deal greenwash? Because it is based on the capitalistic world where GDP must grow, which means we have to increase consumption all the time. And an example of that question mark in my head is Germany, who is leading the whole thing, is still opening new coal mines, is building the gas pipe, cutting off other countries like Ukraine and others, and they leading, and it's all based on growth. So is it greenwashing, or should we start speaking about we need a complete radical change of the system?
Oh, easy question. No, but an area I am constantly thinking about. What we know is the system today is not working, right? Our numbers are going the wrong way consistently. As much as we've talked about it, like you say, the pledges, the agreements, they haven't worked. Where we go next is something I'm really, I don't have the answer, but I just think it's something we need to spend a lot more time talking about. Even in Ireland, when we're talking about this 51% reduction, I don't think we really understand what that's going to take, or we understand where it gets us to in terms of a society. And yes, we can roll out the renewable electricity, and yes, we can do the EVs. For me, they're the easy stuff, right? They're the greener version of exactly how we live today. And I don't think that's actually going to translate into a world that has planetary limits, and it does. So we need to have a bigger discussion around whether, some people call it degrowth, some people talk around well-being indicators going beyond GDP. We know GDP is not fit for a sustainable world. We only have to look at how GDP did throughout COVID, right? It did really well. We didn't do so well as a society. Think about the health impacts, the mental impacts, the community losses. None of that showed up with GDP. So we need a much more holistic view, including the health of our natural world in terms of how we measure we go forward. But I do think what the Green Deal is doing is it's being a line of first defense to that future growth while we're still in this capitalist model. It's trying to catch the flow of finance, for example, and try and get it towards more sustainable options. But you're dead right, there's still fossil fuel plants being built. We're trying to get agreement at COP to have an end of date, that it has to end. We know that the majority of our fossil fuels have to stay in the ground if we've any chance of meeting that 1.5. So we're, these few weeks that build up to COP are typical negotiations where the pledges get a bit more ambitious day to day. And I don't know, will it translate to actual action? But it'll come down, again, it comes back to my point that no one person, not the EU, not the Taoiseach of our country is going to make this happen. It's going to have to be all of us using all of our roles, whether that's in civil society, whether that's within corporations, as a voter, as a shopper, using our voice and influence to drive change. Because even though if we know the system wasn't broken, we can't just be complicit in letting it continue. So we don't have an exact answer for you. I share some of your concerns. And the big thing for me is that we really need to start, a national conversation about where we're going as a society and what it actually means to live in a sustainable Ireland and world.
Yes, thank you so much. It's just in this context, when you think about everyone is blaming China for emissions, but actually China wouldn't have the emissions if we didn't buy from them. We are creating the demand.
Yes.
So there's no point to blame China. And that's why I'm thinking that we need to change the way we think about that and act.
100%. And there's not enough talk around legacy emissions and responsibility. Like, we are a rich country in Ireland. Might not always feel like it, but we have, we've grown our society not paying the environmental price that we've done, the damage that we've done. And now it's absolutely on us and other developed nations to do, 7% is the average reduction. We should be doing much more, if we were really reflecting our behavior over the last few decades. But at the bare minimum, we have to put up the funds to help really support developing nations skip this fossil fuel dependency stage we've got ourselves into and get onto the greener. And we're going to have to talk about consumption. We can't get away from that. Consumption is a big part of this. We can't just have greener versions of everything. We're going to have to stem and reduce some of the demand as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Gosia and Ali. Debbie has an interesting question there. Would you like to come in, Debbie?
Yep, great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, I'm in the dark here. It's a chat of life before we started. Great talk, Ali. Thank you very much. My question is about, I suppose it's a little bit of a chicken and egg type of scenario. I work in a big retail bank, and I think a lot of companies are probably the same. They're waiting to see who goes first. They don't want to lose market share. They don't want to lose shareholders. They don't want to lose consumers or customers. And I think governments, consumers, and you were talking there about all of us using our roles in whatever capacity that we're in. how do we force everybody to kind of lean in rather than, well, consumers will wait till governments regulate it, governments will wait till consumers vote for them, companies will wait till customers demand it. You know, somebody has to go first. How do we move that needle, I suppose? Yeah,
it's an area just I'm fascinated with, because it's so frustrating, right? Isn't it? You know, when you're trying to drive that change, and then there's the very real perceived challenges that we see them, exactly what you're saying about moving first. So we have a very unlevel playing fields in Ireland at the moment, where we're not rewarding the more sustainable behaviours. But equally, we have every company saying, oh, you know, if the government puts in this regulation, or if the government does this, then we'll act. But we don't hear those calls publicly. We don't hear those calls loudly. And you can't have it both ways. And this is where sustainability gets really difficult, and we have to push ourselves out of our comfort zone. And we have to understand exactly that. It's chicken and egg, you know. Politics is based on voters. They're not going to come out and save the day. We have to understand where the influencing and messaging is coming from. So if, as industries, we're not going to move until the whole industry does, then we need to start shouting about it, and we need to, you know, let that be known that that is what we're waiting for, is that more level playing field. We see big sweeps in the likes of the US now coming down in terms of that corporate playing field. Like that example I gave you, we're seeing that playing out now. You know, companies who said they were going to back this progressive, they were going to back the climate tax, and they're saying, no, they're not ready. You cannot have it both ways. So, you know, it's going to be a difficult one. We're talking about a lot of incumbent businesses who are not ready for this transition. Others who are more progressive, who are waiting in the sidelines. But we're just all going to have to start using more influence to drive that forward. Because like there's no one, so you know, we can bring in regulation and that'll help in legislation, but we still need those wider influences coming through. So I think, you know, let's see what happens in COP. Let's see how the sectoral stuff lands here, but let's not sit back and wait for that to do the job either. Like, you know, let's see what else we can do as individuals, as employees, as business, you know, representative groups as well. Everyone has to use their voice in this.
Super, thank you.
Thanks, thank you both. Victoria Doyle has a question. I don't know if Victoria is still here. I don't think I can see Victoria in the chat. Are you here, Victoria? I don't think so. I think we'll move on to Connor. Yeah. Sorry, Victoria, there? No, we'll move on to Connor.
Hi,
Connor.
thank you. Thanks, Ali. That was fantastic talk, and really enjoyed it. I suppose the question I was asking is around, you highlighted just one example, the food and the wastage we have on food, where our organizations only engaging in those elements of the goals that suit their commercial needs. So take the food example, where you go into any supermarket, whether it's food, whether it's confectionery, there's all this buy one, get one free. Yeah. Everything is encouraging greater purchase and to an extent greater consumption, but in turn greater wastage. Yeah. So how do we marry that piece of the commercial aspect for the company without the penalties? If they haven't got those, there's nothing really to stop them. So
yeah, no, you're dead right. And this is an example of exactly like you say, where you'll see industry sustainability strategies, and they'll tackle, you know, the refrigeration energy in store, maybe the type of packaging on the product, but not looking at the root drivers of some of this waste. And that might be, you know, the standards they're putting on primary producers, changing the goalposts all the time, refusing to sell the bruised products, you know, thinking we won't buy it. And like you say, those bog offs, the buy one, get one free. So this is an area we're going to probably need to push with more regulation, I think, and again, level that playing field on this. We have a situation now where our response to food waste is like our response to a lot of waste. It's end of life, particularly in Ireland. So we deal with it when it's already out there. So at the moment, we have a big focus on getting everyone the brown bin, you know, awareness campaigns, using up your waste, but we need to go back up the supply chain and start stemming it everywhere, because it occurs across the whole supply chain. And that's something that's not just in food, that's happening in fashion, it's happening in white appliances as well. You know, we're waiting until they're waste and then we're dealing with them, and now we need to push it right back up. So there's lots of stuff, again, like in the EU Green Deal around the circular economy package, which is trying to weave these standards and regulation in, but we're going to have to, again, like these are the things that are going to be battles, right? They're harder, they're more challenging than the easier stuff around packaging or the awareness campaigns. But this is where you start to have impact. So I don't know what it will look like in Ireland, if it will be, kind of strong legislation, or it'll be more a shining a light on those companies who do it and don't do it kind of thing, like we've seen with the deposit return schemes. But people are getting a lot more aware, and you can feel the pressure building. Didn't speak so much about it, but that pressure we feel as individuals to sort all this out, we have to let that go. Get over thinking about our footprints and more about our handprints. So letting the retailers know we don't want this. Again, using your vote, talking to your communities. Yes, of course, do what you can, but let's shift the responsibility back to where the problem is stemming from.
Great, thank you.
Great, Ali, we have a good few more questions now. I'm not going to keep you here all night, but we might keep going for another 5 minutes if that's okay with you. So David has a question about B Corporation. Do you want to come in, David?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. I suppose just to reiterate what everyone else has said, thank you very much for a very interesting and insightful presentation, Ali. I think my question kind of follows on from Debbie's question around the B Corporation certificate and what other existing frameworks or certifications exist. And also, I suppose it's great to see as well, but what sort of rewards and incentives exist for having these certifications outside of investors, good brand reputation, and I suppose customer awareness?
Yeah. So B Corp, like I say, it's growing. It was off to a slow start in Ireland, but really picking up. The reason I like B Corp is it's kind of holistic and it's invasive kind of approach. It gets in there in terms of what's happening in the company. But there's a plethora of certification of frameworks out there, which I kind of think has been part of the problem, because there's kind of something for everyone, depending on no matter how much effort you're putting in. But what we're starting to see now, particularly in companies that are supplying into another, a B2B company, is that they're identifying what is an acceptable standard for them, and they're applying them as part of their supplier criteria as well. So that might be specific to the product or the industry, depending on what the key hotspots are, the key climate risks are. And like I said, there's a big range of them out there, but it's starting to be used as kind of a tick box tool to push it back on suppliers to do some of the heavy lifting around that scope 3 stuff. So I suppose it depends on how you want to use it. Is it public, on pack? And again, like there's over 300 eco labels on the market in Europe alone, and we all probably only know about 3 of them. Maybe fair trade, maybe rainforest. So the value of them, sometimes I would question. And at the end of the day, if your impact isn't coming true in terms of those climate maths and those climate metrics, then it's not working, because maybe it'll buy you 6 months in terms of consumer perception that you're doing something, but people are digging now. They want to know where the gaps are, and it's not enough to just have something on your pack. That you're going to have to do the job. And the move to eco labels now is happening quite fast. So there's a trial happening across Europe. Some companies are trialing their own, where they're trying to get a more aligned version of that eco carbon label on pack, so that I can compare, dairy milk with almond milk in my hand and understand the carbon impact. So I think we'll see a lot more standardization of those, hopefully a lot less noise, and more proof points, lots more proof points, because I think customers have, distrust of what's being said at the moment and what's actually happening behind the scenes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wayne.
Yeah, I think there's a huge body of work to be done in terms of labeling. I mean, as a consumer, it's so difficult. When I go shopping, I think there's probably security cameras zooming in on me because I'm looking at labels, trying to figure out what is in it: cotton, polyester, is it really recycled? Is it, it's such, you have to go on a hunt to find that information. And, that's just with fashion garments. So there's huge opportunities there in terms of kind of marketing, communications, and marketing in general around that. I think people are getting much hungrier for that information and knowledge.
100%. We have to learn lessons from the past around, because it is like, this area is complex. How do you account for this? The data we have here in Ireland might be different to data in the UK. How do we, make it? And companies that, operate across different borders are looking for one version of a label that they can use. But it's exactly, that's the shift we need to have. We need to stop having the consumer spending an hour walking around we need every option on the shelf sustainable and have passed a certain test to get on that shelf. And that's what the EU is trying to do. But there'll be pushback from certain industries who don't want their data shown in a certain way. They want a friendlier style, and that's where we need to push for more, because who wants to be wasting hours walking around and you're not even sure then if you've got the right product. We need to change that dynamic, and then we make it easier for all of us to make the right choice.
Ali, thank you very much. There are a few more questions, but it's 1:15 now, so I think we may draw things to a close. I think you've given us a huge amount of your time, and I think the Q&A session has been really fantastic. So I might actually pass over to Lucia Walsh to say a few words of thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Like, the comments and the questions that you all have, are really fantastic, and it's really great to see such a engaging conversation. So thank you, Ali, very much for this very insightful talk and giving us lots of ideas for actions within our own organizations, but also as individual. And thank you, Colin, for hosting the Connected Seminar Series. We are delighted to have the Planet series as well. And also thank you to Dr. Ete Kidney, the head of School of Marketing, where this great program, with the home of this great program. So I think you are going to take, I don't know if Ete wants to say anything. I see you there on the camera.
I'm afraid my kids are killing each other in the background, Lucia. Okay. I won't last too long, but thank you very much, Ali, for a fantastic program, and to thank Ali for this program panel. Important to the program, important that we hope to make.
The voices of the future are there in the background to sing.
Yeah.
Good to see.
Thanks, Ali. I suppose just to close and to thank the team running some brilliant initiatives in TU Dublin. It's a core pillar of our strategy. It's one of the 3 pillars of the TU Dublin strategy, and I know within the Faculty of Business, lots of our colleagues, Olivia and Lucia and Attain and Alico and a bunch more, are doing great work in sustainability with new programs, new modules and initiatives, and it's wonderful to see. It's a existential issue for us, I think, and for the next generation, and it's something that we can't ignore and we have to absolutely get right. So Ali, thanks a million for sharing all your wisdom. Hopefully we can coerce you into coming back again for something else, but really enjoyed it, and by the volume of questions and so on, I just see it's had such a great impact. So thanks again, and thanks to everyone, and please do come along to the rest of our Connected Planet events or our wider emerging technology series that we'll be kicking off in November. We've some great speakers and great events coming up, so please do come along and invite friends and colleagues along as well. So thanks all, have a great evening.
Thanks a million.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks a million, Ali. See you soon.
See you soon. Thanks for coming. Oh yeah, I'll send over my slides, see if they're any use.
That would be fantastic,
yeah, no problem.
Ali. Absolutely great.
Thank you so much, Ali.
Thanks.
My pleasure. Thanks a million.
It would be so much better to have you in person, but this is more sustainable, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was pushing Colin now. Where's my coffee and croissant?
I know. Oh, yeah. but you get to put the kids to bed.
I know. Yeah, that's it. Exactly. Double job.
I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing now.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Thanks, Ali.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Olivia, we're on in 10 minutes with you separately.
Yeah, or maybe 15. I'll give people a chance to get a cup of tea or coffee. Okay, bye.
Thanks,
See you in a few minutes. Bye-bye.